Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we've got a project that's a little bit different from what we normally do. We've got a Tamiya Scania R470 that's already been modified and upgraded. It's owned by a friend of mine who wants me to fit some more shiny bits and upgrade the electronics using one of my controller boards. In addition to the truck, we've got a FlySky i6S 10-channel stick radio, a Lisu gearbox cover, which I later noted this one's got the MAN logos on rather than Scania, so I think that's going to need to be swapped out. There's a Scania edge-lit board to go behind the cab, the rather nice Lisu rear bumper kit with a large amount of lights, and of course we've got one of my controller boards to go in. Now this one's a Rev C board, so one newer than the one you saw last week, being fitted to the 1850L. On first inspection, the model side of the truck has been done rather well. The paint looks good and the livery looks very smart. It's all nicely done. If we pop the body clips out of the front bull bars, we can hinge it down so we can tilt the cab forward. It's got one of those magnetic mounts for the cab rather than the post and clip that they come with stock. It really does make things a lot easier to access. The stock clip location can really make it a bit fiddly, especially if you can't get any light on it. Tilting the cab forward, we can see the little issue. Now it's worth noting my friend bought it more or less like this, and of course it does function. There's a couple of boards in there that handle the brake lights and indicators, along with an RC switch for the other functions. The trouble is, if you've got a bundle like this, and if anything works loose, it's a complete nightmare to find the problem. After teasing it out, you can see there's numerous extension leads and Y leads hiding in there. There's wires tapping into various places, and a fair bit of electrical tape. Here's the RC switch. Now all it does is take a servo signal, controlled by a switch on the radio, to turn something on and off. In this case, I think it's connected to the four lights on the roof bar. Now we won't be reusing the switch, but we can cut it free where it's spliced into the light wiring. There's no sense in being more destructive than we need to. The switch works perfectly well after all, and once it's free, we'll put it in a box that will go back with the truck. The RC switch is still attached to something else, but the wires dive into the bundle, so we'll have to trace those once we've thinned it down a bit. When unplugging the receiver, it's not a bad idea to make notes of what's plugged in where. We'll probably do all the channel assignments from scratch, but sometimes it's useful to know what sticks and switches did what. Unplugging some Y leads, and we find one splitting off the steering servo and one of the controller boards. It'll be handling the indicators when you steer more than a certain amount. Okay, now we can see where the RC switch is going off to. It looks like it's connected to the edge-lit panel in the cab that sits between the seats. It's also connected to the four spotlights on the grille at the front of the cab. Now there's nothing special to worry about here, so we can just clip them all free. The servo plug on the switch connects to another lead that has taps on the power wires to run the amber lights on the side panels. We'll peel back the electrical tape just to make sure there's nothing in there that we need to know about. It's not impossible that there might be some resistors in there. In this case though, it's just a power tap, so we can clip the wires and finally remove the RC switch. Next there's the light control board. It's a pretty small unit with lots of wires hanging off it. Handily, most of them are on connectors. If we unplug the connectors that go off to the lights, all that's left is a pair of hard-wired wires that go off to a piezo beeper that beeps when going backwards. Now I'm not sure who or what board this is, but it's certainly quite a neat package. Like the RC switch, it's going to go in a surplus box to go back when the truck's complete. In the cab, all that's left are the wires going off to the various lights. To get them out, we need to take the cab and the bumper off the chassis. Now normally the front bumper would be held on with two M3x6s into the metal bracket that attaches the cab to the chassis. Because we've got the bull bar there, there's two rather long screws that go right the way through. It's not the nicest of mounting methods, but it does work well enough. With the bull bar off, the front bumper can be moved away from the chassis so we can get to the two screws that attach the cab. This time we need to be a bit more careful so the cab doesn't drop when the second screw comes out. Unfortunately, we still can't fully remove the cab because there's a minor tangle of wires going up under the interior and the floor plate. Thankfully, the guy who made up the interior has fitted it with a couple of screws and not just glued it down. So if we remove them, it comes away cleanly, revealing a zip tie that's strapping some of the wires down. If we cut it, we can pull the wires through and move the cab and the bumper off to the side. So we can see and tidy up the motor wires, we'll need to remove the floor plate and the arches. Just like the other Tamiya trucks, it's held on with 6 M3x6s through the top. Remove them and it just lifts away. Now we can see the motor wires where the builder has spliced extensions onto the ESC wires with bullet connectors. Again, perfectly functional, but a little bit untidy. We'll replace it with some nice colour-coded wire and gold connectors. The side panels have some wiring in, so to make it easier to redo, we will just remove them from the chassis. There's 2 small screws on each side. They come out and the panels just come away. Now, because the screws are so small, it's going to be safest to thread them back into the metal stays so they're kept with the chassis. There's not much on the inside, just 2 LEDs with their 1 resistor each. And on one side there's the reversing beeper. These should be rather easy to rewire, but we will need to check the resistor value. I would imagine it's a bit conservative, so it's safe at higher voltages. That really just leaves the rear lights now. We need to remove them entirely because the new bumper replaces the complete assembly. Under the chassis we find some more zip ties that are keeping the wires safe, so before we try and remove the lights we need to clip all the zip ties to release the wires. Then once the wires are free, we can feed them back through up under the chassis so they're ready to pull out when we remove the lights. I think the best way to remove them for now is just remove the 2 self-tappers and 2 M3 screws that attach the metal brackets to the chassis extension. The self-tappers just thread straight into the plastic extension, and the M3 screws thread into an aluminium tube that ties the sides together. When they're removed, the light should come free. However, the mud flap on this truck spans the whole width, so they're going to come away as a pair. So that's the chassis stripped back far enough to be getting on with. We will probably need to remove the chassis extension at the back for the new bumper, but we'll deal with that when we fit it. Having said that, when I was about to put the chassis out of the way, I noticed the coupler was at a bit of a funny angle. It should be sloped down towards the back. If you look carefully, you can see the little scissor spring is the wrong way round. Plus, it's kind of hanging in the breeze a bit. Now, we won't fix it right now, but we are going to remove the plate. It's just 4 M3x6s for the coupler plate and 2 more for the lever plate. I think we might add a servo to release the coupler while it's off too. The one I designed for the 4x2 Actros should be a direct fit. Now next I was going to have a look at the nice Lisu bumper kit to see what's what, but I very quickly noticed that they have some really small 2 and 2.5mm hex-headed screws. I don't have anything that small on hand, so we can't start the build just yet. I think it would also make sense if it's a separate video anyway. It's going to make a better reference or guide if it's not part of something else. The front bumper needs the current lights removing. There's the usual 3 and 5mm LEDs for the stock clusters, and there's a Lisu spotlight panel in the middle. The Lisu panel is just sandwiched between the 2 parts of the bumper. There's 4 2mm self-tappers to remove, and the whole lot comes apart. I noticed when taking it apart the panel is colliding with something, so the inner panel of the bumper is actually being bent around it. There might be a bit of trimming with the Dremel required, just to make it all fit nicely. The main lights have been wired up quite nicely. It all looks nice and tidy. I was tempted to cut the wires and reuse the LEDs, but I think it's going to be easier just to remove the LED clamps and keep these ones intact. It'll make it easier to reuse the old light controller, if nothing else. The LED clamps are all held on with some more 2mm self-tappers, so all we need to do is remove all of them and the LEDs just pop out. The remains of the wiring can go into the surplus box, ready to be reused. When we get to it, we will use all new 3 and 5mm LEDs and wire them up as common anode arrays. There's one more thing to pull apart and inspect. We need to see what's happening inside the roof box. To remove it, we need to remove the dashboard. And to remove the dashboard, we need to remove the grille. The grille is held on with 2 screws from the inside. We just remove them and the grille should come away. Now we can get to the screw heads for the screws that attach the dashboard. Remove them and the dashboard is free to come out. Usually they'd also be holding on the seat mounting brackets, which always makes them a bit more fiddly than I'd like. But with this install it's all nice and straightforward. We've got a top line roof, so it's mounted a little bit differently from the Tamiya box. They still got the 4 screws, but rather than use pillars, they've just put them right out onto the edges. With the Tamiya box, you can usually get to the front screws without removing the dashboard. With the 4 screws out, the roof lifts off, and we can see what we've got. Well, it looks like the light bar has the usual 2 pairs of 2 series LEDs. They're really designed to connect to a Tamiya controller with its constant current output, rather than connecting directly to a 5 or 6 volt supply, so we're going to end up rewiring them. Also, on the top is a rather nice LED beacon. It connects directly to a channel on the receiver, so other than tidying up the wire run, there's nothing that we need to do to it. This truck, of course, is going to be getting sound, so it's going to need a speaker. Something around 50mm is the usual trick. We're going to need to cut out the cross-shaped sprue and make a panel, but that's pretty simple to do. The tricky bit is when the roof's attached, it's got a crossbar that comes partway over the cutout in the cab roof, limiting the maximum size of the speaker. We'll need to have a think about it and see what we can do. I suppose the obvious thing is to use a pair of smaller speakers to shift the air rather than trying to do it with one large one. So there we go then, one Scania stripped back and ready for some fancy new electronics. There's lots to do to get it all up and running, with all the gubbins packed into the space behind the false wall on the interior and the back of the cab, so it should make for an interesting install. Right, that's it for this week then. As always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a message if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!